My name's Will Potter. I'm really happy to be here, happy to be part of their film, Cowspiracy, which I'm sure you all have seen by now. I'm an investigative journalist and also a TED Fellow, and my work focuses on civil liberties post-September 11th. And it might seem like an unlikely fit for this type of a conference focused on animal issues and animal agriculture. But to explain that relationship, I think we need to start off by talking about what a farm is. And we all know this is what factory farming is. And we all know that because we're told stories from a very young age about farms. We have songs, we have play sets like this one. I had a very similar one growing up with happy pigs and happy chickens and happy sheep, happy little cowboys and little red barns dotting the countryside. Who has heard and seen imagery like this? And the industry and corporations have picked up on that, and that's why you have it on the side of butter and milk containers and eggs and everything else, perpetuating this mythology, this cultural narrative that we have. But the reality is quite different. And the only way we've been able to see the true nature of modern animal agriculture has been through the work of undercover investigators who have documented systemic animal cruelty and standard industry practices on factory farms. These investigations have revealed horrific animal cruelty, like workers punching cows in the face, beating chickens, swinging turkeys by their necks and their wings into cages, just unimaginable cruelty. But they've also revealed what's completely, absolutely normal, standard industry practices. How upwards of 9 billion animals are raised every single year in the United States alone for food. These investigations have been so powerful that they've actually led to things like the largest meat recall in U.S. history, when the Humane Society exposed cows who were too sick to walk, which are so common in factory farming that they're referred to as downers. These downers were being pushed by bulldozers. That's illegal, obviously, because you don't want sick animals being killed and turned into food and then being consumed by humans. In this case, the facility was one flagged by the USDA as kind of one of their star facilities, and it was supplying in part the National School Lunch Program. These investigations have been so powerful that they've led to some of the first criminal prosecutions in U.S. history for cruelty against farm animals. Now, in a little bit, I'll talk about the lack of protections for any animals on farms, so you get an idea of how historic this truly has been. But I think most importantly, they're coming at a time where we're having a massive cultural shift in how we talk about farm animals. Now, this comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. We see it in states like California, Florida, Arizona, taking steps to eliminate the most egregious standard industry practices like gestation crates or debeaking and things like that. We have a study out of Michigan State saying 70% of voters in every state would support outlawing gestation crates. Now, these are crates that keep pigs confined so closely that they're not able to turn around their entire lives. The industry says it's to keep these pigs from rolling over and squashing their piglets, but it's funny how that doesn't exist in nature for any animals, and mom animals and their babies get along just fine. And also through consumer pressure and advocacy campaigns, it's led to retailers changing their suppliers in response to consumer demand. Places like McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. Now, it obviously doesn't mean the battle is done, but they're first steps, right? And they're big first steps. This was one of the most interesting things I came across in my research of every time these stories come out, every time this undercover footage is aired on television or in documentaries, it results in consumers cutting back their consumption of meat. So in other words, the writing is on the wall for the industry, for factory farming, for animal agriculture. And they have a problem on their hands. But their response has been to say things like, body slamming piglets to death humane, pork experts say. They're digging in their heels, defending the most cruel practices, despite a changing culture that objects to them. The message from the animal agriculture industry is, we don't need activists to police us. We can do it ourselves. How many of you know, though, that in the United States alone, upwards of 9 billion animals are raised that have virtually no protection at any level of government? Animals raised on farms are specifically exempted from the Animal Welfare Act, which is the dominant legislation preventing cruelty to animals. There are some laws that protect animals at the point of transfer and transport, but even they specifically exempt poultry. And birds are upwards of 90% of animals raised and killed for food. Now, on top of that, you have about 25 different states that have exemptions for what are called customary practices. And those are defined by the industry. So if the industry says it's normal to cut the beaks off of chickens and the tails off of piglets, if the industry says it's normal to keep them in tiers of battery cages or to keep them in gestation crates or to prevent them from ever seeing the sun or touching grass, then by definition, it is not animal cruelty. In other words, you have one of the largest industries on the planet feeding hundreds of millions of people, killing 9 billion animals every year with virtually no oversight by any level of government, and the industry is saying we want to keep it that way. Back up 1 second. Going so far now, as they're introducing and sponsoring and supporting legislation that specifically criminalizes anyone who takes photographs or video exposing animal cruelty on factory farms. These laws are called ag-gag laws. Ag is in agriculture, gag is to silence. I'll be talking about them much more a little bit later on, but I want to step back and talk about how we got to this point. How we got to the point where legislation is being considered to criminalize the person who exposes criminal behavior. And so I think to understand that, in my research, we have to go back all the way to the early 1980s. That's when the animal rights and environmental movements were growing very quickly and very boldly in the United States. You had a diverse movement with above ground and underground illegal activists. Groups like the Animal Liberation Front breaking into laboratories, stealing animals. And then national organizations like PETA, publicly supporting them, obviously not engaged in those tactics, but using that video footage, using the photographs, waging campaigns, making victories. At the same time, every time that those types of tactics were discussed in the press, they weren't regarded as terrorism, they were heroes. You had headlines like the LA Times, environmental warriors use radical tactics to make a point. Over and over again in my research, going back through archives, you see these types of headlines and profiles of these people as environmental warriors, animal heroes. So the industry had a really big problem on its hands. You have a movement that's growing quickly and boldly, that's diverse, that's united, and that's making progress. And so what they set out to do is to shift the public discussion so that you all are not regarding these people as heroes, or environmental warriors, or even criminals. Instead, they just made up a new word in 1985 called eco-terrorism, pulled it out of thin air. And then over the next 20 years, they used that language repeatedly to start shifting the public narrative and shifting how we think about these issues. They did that through advertising campaigns. This was one from the early 80s by the fur industry. Meet the world's newest terrorist. Don't tolerate terrorism in America, fur is for life. And you kind of have this, either Williamsburg hipster / Steve Urkel vibe going on with an axe. But no matter how outrageous those campaigns were, they slowly worked their ways to the top levels of government. To the point where in about 2005, the FBI was routinely referring to animal rights and environmental activists as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. Keep in mind, in the history of these social movements, no one has been injured. That's not something that the civil rights movement can say, or the anti-apartheid movement, or labor movements. It's incredibly, especially unique in social movements to not have physical violence in any capacity. Nevertheless, this has become the dominant narrative. And that's a very truncated look. I talk a lot more in depth in my book, Green is the New Red. I have copies out here. That's my shameless plug, the only one I'll make today. That I chart that history and also tell it in a narrative way of the people who have been most affected, who have gone to prison for these issues, who've been classified as terrorists. But that's a very short way of explaining how we got to this point of ag-gag. And what you all need to know right now is that there are three main types of this legislation that are being considered. The first and the earliest was just banning photography and video that exposed animal cruelty. It includes language like this about recording an image or sound from a factory farm. And also anyone who uploads, downloads, or transfers it. In other words, wrapping up social media and YouTube and online sharing with that as well. And also sharing to people like me in the press. The second I would call misrepresentation. And that's the industry saying, all right, the public doesn't like these bans on photography. So instead we're going to say, well, if you misrepresent yourself on a job application, if you don't say that, well, you've actually volunteered for the Cowspiracy team or you've worked with the Humane Society, then that can be a criminal offense. Now, I'm sure none of you have ever fudged anything on your resume or CV. If you happen to, maybe inflate some accomplishments or whatever, at worst, you might get, a talking down to at a job. You might even lose your job. You're not going to face criminal charges. The third type is, I think, one of the most insidious, and that's what I would call mandatory reporting. And that's the industry saying, hold up, we had no idea what happened every single day to 9 billion animals on all of our farms. And we appreciate you bringing this information forward to us. We just think that you should have to turn it over to us within 24 hours. And by the way, if you turn it over to police or to the media, that's a criminal offense. Does that make sense? So if any of you don't have to be, JDs to understand, you've seen some Law and Order episodes, you got to build a case, right? You don't shut down a case after 24 hours. You show patterns of abuse. The industry wants to pretend, that this is just a few bad apples doing this stuff. And those few bad apples are overwhelmingly immigrant populations, not native English speakers. They don't have access to legal resources. They don't have access to attorneys. They don't know what to do. Their livelihoods depend on their jobs. Providing for their families depends on their jobs. And it's putting an unfair and unnecessary burden on them to come forward to their boss and report what their boss already knows is happening. Does that make sense? And the industry knows that, so it's an underhanded attempt. If we want to understand where ag-gag in particular came from, though, we need to look at a few different sources. In my research, I came across a model piece of legislation called the Animal and Ecological Terrorism Act. This was proposed by a group called ALEC. Have you all heard of ALEC? The American Legislative Exchange Council. And the way ALEC works is they have these conferences and they pay for state lawmakers to fly in from all over the country. And when the state lawmakers come in, they pay for them to go to Broadway shows and fancy dinners, and they go out to restaurants, they go skeet shooting and do all this stuff, right? And meanwhile, the corporate representatives and corporate sponsors stay back and draft legislation, literally writing laws that are then taken back by the state lawmakers, introduced in the presence of audiences like this one, and hold up, well, we have this model piece of animal and ecological terrorism legislation to go after this terrorism threat, and the other lawmakers have no idea it was actually written by corporations that are trying to silence their opposition. So the ALEC bill has a lot of different elements of ag-gag. Some of the places where ag-gag has been passed, the governors are proud to stand with their industry lobbyists. And don't try to read all this stuff. The most important parts are seeing the color coding that I added in here between different states. So in other words, either the state lawmakers are all equally brilliant across multiple states in drafting the most, poetic legal verse, or they're copying and pasting, do a little Control-C, Control-V, and then introduce a new bill. Another backdrop to this is a law called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. It was passed in 2006, I was invited to testify based on my reporting as the only opposition witness, and it was me sitting there with the FBI, Department of Justice, GlaxoSmithKline, and an animal experimenter. And I, of course, no matter how long I've reported in DC, I wanted to view that as an honor, right? Not every day that in your journalism you get to testify and try to make a difference in democratic processes. Well, that's a completely naive and dumb thing to think. I know that, but you still want to think. And the couple days before I was actually scheduled to testify, I got a call from the Democrats on the committee. They say, hey, we just want to remind you that Democrats and Republicans, we all support this bill. So, we appreciate you testifying because we have to have an opposition witness. But if you can raise some minor concerns of what you think should be tweaked. I was like, oh yeah, that's totally cool. That I compared it to the Red Scare. That went over really, really well. Anyway, these are some of the industries that have supported it, though. All your favorites. The National Chicken Council, the pork industry, Pfizer, Wyeth, GlaxoSmithKline, the fur industry, the pet industry, circuses, egg producers, you name it. Only reason I found out about this is someone leaked to me that they have an internal website for their lobbying around this. And it was password protected, and being the real good investigative journalist I am, I entered the username of test and the password of test. And it opens wide up, and they have a little they've got a write-up on me and my website and listed under the opposition. And then they have a PDFs that list all the supporters and all their sponsors. Now, when I testified, it got hostile because members of the committee said, nothing like what you're warning against will ever happen. It will never be used against undercover investigators, never used against boycotts, against civil disobedience. Well, we find out through the Freedom of Information Act, my colleague Ryan Shapiro at MIT learned that it was used precisely for that. That there was an FBI open investigation into undercover investigators considering prosecuting them under the previous version of the law that was not even as bad as this new one. The industry is referring to the need for specialized legislation like this, calling activists terrorists, ag-gag, because they're comparing it to things like hate crimes. It's always been possible to punish those who burn crosses, deface houses, or otherwise harass people because of their race, religion, or sexual orientation. This is totally the same thing, right? Protecting our profits from undercover investigators. Now, we saw where this was heading in the first ag-gag prosecution. This was in Utah against a young woman named Amy Meyer. And Amy had heard that you could see cows being pushed by bulldozers outside of a slaughterhouse. And she knew, remember that example I brought up previously from the Humane Society? She knew this was a really big deal, that it led to the largest meat recall in U.S. history. She knew they should not be doing this. So she went out and she did what any of us would in the age of, being tethered to this all the time, right? And she videotaped it. She did it from the public street. That's why the image is so grainy and distant. And you can see exactly what is documented here, the cow being pushed by the bulldozer. And she was arrested and prosecuted under ag-gag. I found out about her case, and we worked together on it. Filed open records requests, got the documentation, found out the mayor is actually the brother of the owner of the slaughterhouse. There's all this very incestuous relationship. Anyway, publicized the story, and within 24 hours it led to such outrage, got picked up by LA Times, MSNBC, you name it, that the prosecutors just said, forget it, and they dropped all the charges. So that's powerful to see because it reminds, I think, all of us that they're terrified about exposure, not just about the cruelty, but against these tactics. But to me, one of the most inspiring and powerful things I've seen come out of ag-gag is this coalition that's emerged, that are groups that frankly are not often in the same room together and are not often on the same page. Now, I know as animal activists, you have no exposure to infighting or, you guys, everybody gets along all the time and is polite and respectful. But that's not always the case. So to see Amnesty International, ACLU, Human Rights Watch, ASPCA, all these groups and many, many more, Teamsters, AFL-CIO, the labor unions, is huge. It's historic. And the message of all of them is that it doesn't matter if you're an animal rights activist. If we let factory farms gag their critics, what issue that you care about is going to be next. And you know what? That's worked. In Pork Network News, for any aspiring journalist, if you want to see the sexy and glamorous life you can hope for, reading on your Friday night Pork Network News and dairy herd management, you see that 73% of their respondents in their poll indicated they don't believe ag laws help agriculture. Another study came out earlier this year, that found that ag laws erode trust in farmers, which is exactly what you would expect. But to have an academic approach to that, actually proving it, is quite powerful. Been a plaintiff in several lawsuits challenging ag-gag as unconstitutional. And we've had some victories. In Idaho, the law was struck down as unconstitutional. And the kind of ruling that, you go to law school or becoming a journalist just dreaming about. I mean, the judge in the case essentially took all of the talking points that I use in events like this and that the attorneys used, saying this is a threat to journalism. It's a threat to the First Amendment. It's a threat to labor unions, to workers' rights, to consumers. They compared it to Upton Sinclair in The Jungle. Think back to high school, at least some of you, if you're over a certain age, had to read The Jungle. But I mean, think about it. If Upton Sinclair were publishing The Jungle right now, his expose and a fictionalized account of meatpacking abuses at the turn of the century, he'd have to have a book trailer. He'd have an Instagram account. He'd have a YouTube channel, right? All this stuff would be criminalized under ag-gag, and the judge agreed with that. But the trend has continued. I mean, even this year in North Carolina, another ag-gag bill was passed. The New York Times editorialized against it, noting that it's not even just limited to agriculture. It's phrased so broadly as to include many other industries as well. One thing I really underestimated, though, when I started working on these issues, in 2000, let alone started working on ag-gag in around 2006, is the potential for them to spread internationally. And so you see in assessments like this by Europol, the European Police Agency, that undercover investigations are described as disinformation methods in order to discredit targets and weaken public acceptance. Images of sick and abused animals are embedded in video footage and made public. This was sent out to all of Western Europe as an advisory of potential terrorism threats. Disinformation methods. In Austria, I gave a speaking tour in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and someone gave me this flyer. My German is really, really, really bad, but they translated it for me and wrote it down, essentially saying, the animal activists are coming, they're spying on your family and your children, we have to stop them. And again, we have the black mask and, this time with the flashlight. I was down in Australia for a month because Australian lawmakers, again, Control-C, Control-V, copied and pasted US-style ag-gag laws in a completely different political and legal system and introduced them because of the industry there. There have been a lot of successes exposing this in Australia and shutting this down, but the battle is far from over, and it keeps popping up. Now, I'll clap for Chris. All of ag-gag has primarily been focused on exposing animal cruelty. And I think, I'm sure you all agree, being here with this Cowspiracy conference, there's been an absence and a hole in the discussion connecting those dots to environmental issues. Now, progress is being made on that, right, in such radical animal liberation publications as Time magazine, noting that a vegetarian diet could help save the planet. But for the most part, what have we been hearing about when we talk about the environmental crisis out here in California? Those fucking almonds, right? Did you have any? Let's not talk about cars or factories or animal agriculture. Those fracking. Let's talk about almonds. And so seeing all of this really got me thinking, how do we expand that narrative and that discussion? While at the same time, ag is being continued to be passed around the country. So as a journalist, I'm committed to continuing exposing these issues, but we have to find new ways of doing it. So I put up a Kickstarter, and we got some drones. And going out on investigations like this, there's a lot you can see from the ground that I've been documenting as well. I mean, you can see the sheer volume of filth and feces that these animals have to stand in all the time. It starts eating away at their skin. The ammonia is cutting into them. They are desperate for any attention, which was shocking to me. I mean, they were just interested in humans being out there, but you can see them joint deep in filth. This was driving through Yakima Valley, Washington, right off the side of the road. See blood and waste in the water. Now, these dairy factory farms in particular produce so much waste, so much manure, so much feces, that it can't be contained. So in this case, you can see it's run over the barriers and it's just flowing outwards. And this is all feces. It's actually running down the street as well. It got to one point that was so bad in this area of Washington state that the Postal Service stopped delivering because their trucks were slipping and sliding in, literally in shit. Now, the industry has a few different ways of trying to get rid of this massive amount of waste. One of the things they do, in their infinite, brilliant wisdom, is when you have antibiotics and toxic chemicals and all this ammonia and feces, why not we just make it airborne? And then spray it over the farms and over the fields. And I should also point out that people live here. I grew up, I had really bad asthma growing up, was super sick. It's under control now. I've done a lot to make that happen. And when I was out there, this woman, Helen Redout, we'll hear about her in a minute, she warned me, she was like, you're gonna get the poo flu. And she was kind of teasing me. And she's like, you city slickers, you're not used to this. And sure enough, I mean, every single time I've been out on the road doing investigations, when I come home, I'm sick for a week. And I don't think it's just because of the asthma and things like that, individual to me. It's just, you're breathing all this in, and you're just surrounded by it. I cannot imagine what it's like for those workers, and of course for the animals as well, and people who live in the area. This was touted as being one of the best out in Michigan. And the difference is they have a liner on their waste lagoon. I love how they call it lagoons too. But you see this, it's the exact same thing. The problem with these liners is they don't last forever. And it's not foolproof. I mean, they have holes in them, they deteriorate, and then the stuff gets in the water supply. It contaminates the drinking water, the well water. So with the drone project, this is me out here in the car. You've got to go out to these, you're in the middle of nowhere in factory farms, and people don't like you going out there and taking photos, or going out with drones and taking photos. I've gotten into really, really heated and quite sketchy encounters with farmers and workers, people pulling out knives and guns and batons, and I haven't had any issues. I don't want to make it sound like that, but it creates a dynamic that I try to be as far away as I can within the range of the equipment. And you start seeing the scope of how these are just moderate-sized factory farms are changing the landscape. The cows in here are in all day long, day after day. They just go on into the horizon, literally as far as you can see. You start seeing the level of just sheer volume of waste that I think is difficult to comprehend from the ground or in numeric terms about the amount of waste these farms produce. This was out in Arizona, and you can see the different stages of the waste as it's moved around to these different lagoons. It starts looking like just this eerie foreign landscape that the scale of it is just staggering. And I'm not just going to keep showing pictures of manure to you all day, but I hope it helps to illustrate the scope of what we're talking about, because we don't get to see this. We don't get to see these systems of moving waste from one lagoon to the other, just stacking them on top of each other, and how that affects everyone in the area, how it affects the environment, the groundwater, the air, as I said. And part of the reason we don't see that is when you're driving down the road, what do you know? With all these little trees planted. So it's not like you just look out and just see huge waste lagoons spanning acres. It just looks like this idyllic setting, right? At most, you might see these little white sheds, but even then, they're facing the other way, so you can't get a picture of how big they are. In this project, though, what's been really important to me is not just expanding that discussion to the environmental impact, but expanding it to the people that are affected as well. I think that's something that we often lose sight of in animal advocacy efforts, to our detriment, because the people who are working and living in these areas don't want to be there. They're not doing it because they grew up wanting to work on a factory farm. And you can see that in the landscape, that where the farm workers live is radically different than where the farm owners live. Upwind, literally. I mean, they don't live downwind of their farms. They know what's going on. They're in the distance. And they also don't like some weirdo tall redhead taking photos of their house, shockingly. But I've been able to meet some really incredible people that have been courageous. This is Helen. When I was out in Washington State, she's just an absolute badass. I mean, she has seen the shift in animal agriculture because her family has had that farm and has had that land for so many decades, that she's seen these CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, coming up, and she's seen what it's done to her community. And so she went out with a group of her friends with disposable cameras and taking point-and-click photos that way. And she had the same experience as I did, people coming out with bats and sticks and whatever, chasing them around, and she kept doing it. And she kept fighting. They even they jokingly refer to these massive tractors that move around the shit on these farms as a Helen now in her community, because they're kind of annoyed with her. But I was talking to her, she took me around to all of the CAFOs in her area. And at first she was like, oh, we really shouldn't be doing this. Like, we're going to get into some hostile situations. And then after we did a few, she was like, all right, let's do it. Let's go. You pop out here, I'll stay at the car. Go for it. This is just a little video I wanted to play where she's singing a song about. Okay, what is this song?
Okay, this is a song I wrote as I was traveling back and forth to the Tri-Cities for the Bosma case, and it's called CAFO Lament, all right? Just woke up in the morning, I felt in the pink, threw open the window, my Lord, what a stink. The smell of sewage, it filled the air. It's more than a person really should bear. I'd go out in the yard to have me some fun, but now with the CAFOs, those days are done. The flies, how they hover and crawl all around, so all our picnics are strictly housebound. Let's see, there's 3 more verses. Oh mother, oh father, I don't feel secure. My life is impacted with too much manure. It runs down the ditches, it stands on the ground, and in my well water it's even been found. We worked all our lives to buy this old house, but now with the CAFOs, those dreams are doused. We got us a realtor, decided to sell, but found that the value was shot all to hell. You folks in the valley, you better wake up. The land that you love is becoming a dump. To make those polluters really aware, speak up right now, show the world that you care. That's it.
That was wonderful.
So in my work, I started out, about 2000 focusing on these issues. And at the time, the focus was on how illegal tactics, breaking into labs, releasing animals from fur farms, civil disobedience, how that was being labeled as terrorism. And over the years, that needle keeps moving and it keeps expanding. And I struggled for a time of explaining what is the connection between those things. How can the same language that's used against the Animal Liberation Front be used against the Humane Society? Groups that do not agree, as you all know. They do not embrace the same tactics. They don't have the same vision. What is going on here? And the conclusion that I don't know what's going on here. The conclusion I came to is the only way we can explain it is that they're all a threat in their different ways. They've all been threats to corporate profit. They've all been threats to people in power. And that threat's evolved. So that the biggest threat facing Big Ag right now isn't that activists are breaking windows, it's they're creating them. They're exposing what happens every single day on these factory farms. They're building massive movements, massive shifts in public opinion, massive shifts in consumer demand. And that's not just limited to the animal cruelty aspect. I think the same thing holds true for the environmental impact, for the impact on workers and on our health. People just don't know. To give you an example, at the kind of the height of ag-gag, when it was being considered in Tennessee, it had passed. It was up for the governor to either sign it into law or to veto it. I did a bunch of speaking events out there. And after one of them at the university, a bunch of grad students and 2 professors came up. And they said all this nice stuff and then said, we just wanted you to know that after your talk, we've decided to go vegan. I said, well, that's cool, but why? I'm not up here standing and telling people to do that. All I'm doing is talking about these tactics and about these issues in a civil liberties angle. And they said, well, what you really do in your work is show people who are aspiring to live by their values. And it makes us want to aspire to live by our values too. And to me, that was just the most beautiful way of encapsulating what's at stake right now, is that we cannot underestimate the power and potential of the people who are not in this room to live by their values and to soon be in this room with you all. It's easy to get mired down in the darkness, and I feel that every single day. I really do, and I struggle with it. But over and over again, I've seen the power and potential of stepping outside of our comfort zones, exposing people to what is truly happening, and seeing that shift take place. And then the numbers grow. So that's the spirit I want to leave this event with you all today, that as you're leaving this room, to not confine these discussions to others that have been here, to step outside with your friends and family, to bring a friend next time, and to continue, to keep this conversation and this movement growing. So in that spirit, thank you very much.